The trauma bay had been quiet for 11 seconds, she counted, when the double doors blew open and a man in tactical gear grabbed the charge nurse by the collar of her scrubs. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Emily Callahan, we need her now." Outside, two Black Hawk helicopters sat on the parking lot asphalt, rotors still spinning, their downdraft bending the oak trees along the hospital's front entrance like they were made of paper. Armed operators in unmarked uniforms fanned across the ambulance bay. Nobody was getting in. Nobody was getting out. Inside Mercy Voss Medical Center, 32 staff members stood frozen. Emily Callahan, the nurse they'd been writing up for 3 months, the one the hospital director had been quietly building a case to terminate, was being escorted toward the exit by security when the soldiers found her. She hadn't even made it to the parking garage. If you're just finding this channel, hit that follow button and stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most of Emily's mornings started lately, with a piece of paper she wasn't supposed to see. She found it tucked under the break room coffee pot, a printed email chain between Director Harlan Moss and the Chief of Staff, Dr. Wendell Pruitt. The subject line read, Performance Remediation Plan, Callahan, E. She'd only gotten through the first paragraph before someone walked in and she shoved it into her scrub pocket. But that first paragraph was enough. Pattern of insubordination, repeated failure to defer to attending physicians, recommend formal review with termination as probable outcome. She poured her coffee. Her hand didn't shake. That surprised her. Emily had been a nurse at Mercy Voss for 14 months. Before that, she'd spent 6 years in the Army as a combat medic attached to the 7th Special Operations Group. 2 deployments to active combat zones, 1 classified assignment she still couldn't talk about, and a medical discharge following a shoulder reconstruction that had healed better than the surgeons expected, but not quite well enough for the Army's standards. None of that was on her badge. Her badge said, E. Callahan, RN, Emergency Services. She was 31 years old. She had brown hair she kept in a low braid because loose hair was a hazard. She had a scar on her left forearm that she never explained, and a habit of going very still when things got bad. Not frozen, just focused, the way she'd learned to get focused when the noise and the chaos and the blood had to become, for the moment, just a problem to solve. The ER at Mercy Voss didn't know what to do with her. The hospital sat at the edge of Delverton, a mid-sized city in the valley between 2 mountain ranges that nobody outside the region had heard of. It was the only Level 2 trauma center within 60 miles, which meant it got everything. Car accidents, farm equipment injuries, industrial incidents from the 3 manufacturing plants on Route 9, and the occasional hunting accident that came in looking worse than it was. The staff was experienced. The equipment was adequate. The hierarchy was rigid in the way that institutions get rigid when the people at the top have been there too long. Dr. Pruitt had been chief of staff for 11 years. Director Moss had been running hospital operations for 8. Between them, they had cultivated a culture where nurses were support staff and physicians were the authority, full stop. No exceptions, no debate. Emily had been an exception from her first week. Not loudly. She'd never raised her voice at an attending. She'd never gone over anyone's head or filed a formal complaint or done anything that could be cleanly labeled insubordination. What she'd done was quieter and apparently more threatening. She'd been right. She'd caught a medication interaction that the resident missed. She'd flagged an abnormal cardiac pattern on a patient who'd been discharged as anxiety and ended up coming back by ambulance 40 minutes later. She'd pushed back on a discharge decision that resulted in the patient's readmission within 6 hours. A metric the hospital tracked, a metric that reflected badly on the attending who'd signed the papers. Nobody thanked her for any of it. What they did instead was start watching her. Dr. Pruitt had called her into his office in her 3rd month. He'd been pleasant about it, offered her coffee, asked about her adjustment to civilian medicine, nodded in that way that doctors nodded when they were about to say something that would take you a minute to recognize as a threat. "You have good instincts," he'd said. "I respect that, but instincts need to be channeled appropriately. The structure here exists for a reason." "I understand that," Emily had said. "Good. Then you understand that when a physician has made a clinical decision, the appropriate response from nursing staff is to document the interaction and move on, not to..." He'd paused, searching for the word. Persist. She had nodded. She had said, "Of course." She had gone back to the floor and kept doing exactly what she'd been doing because she'd also learned in 6 years of combat medicine that the structure existed until someone was dying, at which point the structure became irrelevant. That tension had been building since November. Now it was February, and the email in her pocket was the answer to a question she'd been quietly asking for weeks. They were going to fire her. The only question was the timing. She finished her coffee, threw the cup away, and went to work. The ambulance bay doors opened at 7:42 a.m., and the paramedics came in fast, faster than the usual controlled urgency, faster than a bad car accident or a stroke, the kind of fast that meant something had gone wrong before they even got to the hospital. GSW, upper thorax, entry just below the clavicle. We think it clipped the subclavian. Patient's BP dropped twice in the unit. We pushed 2 liters and he's holding, but barely. The patient was a man in his late 50s, heavy set, dressed in what had been an expensive suit. His face was gray. His breathing was labored in a specific way. Not the slow, shallow breathing of blood loss alone, but something more pressured, more mechanical. An oxygen mask sat crooked on his face. The paramedic on the left was holding a compress to his chest that had soaked through twice. Emily was closest to the bay. She stepped in automatically, her hands going to the patient's wrist for a pulse, while the paramedic was still giving report. The pulse was there. Rapid, thready, inconsistent. She looked at his neck. The jugular veins were distended. Not dramatically, not the textbook presentation, but they were up. She could see it. The attending on duty was Dr. Marcus Brell, a hospitalist who'd been pulled to cover the ER that morning because their regular attending had called in sick. Brell was competent with the routine cases. He was already moving toward the trauma bay, already calling out orders, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who expected the room to organize itself around him. Trauma Bay 1, get me a chest tray, 2 large bore IVs if they don't have them, CBC, BMP, type and cross. Dr. Brell. Emily stepped alongside him. I want to flag something. He didn't look at her. Go ahead. His neck veins are elevated. Trachea looks midline right now, but his breath sounds are going to be unequal on the left. I think we're looking at a tension pneumo developing, not just hemorrhage. Brell glanced at her badge. Noted. Let's get him on the monitor first. If it is tension, waiting for the monitor could cost us the window. He looked at her then. Something moved through his expression. Not quite annoyance, more like the particular patience of someone who was about to demonstrate why the concern was unnecessary. I appreciate the input, Ms. Callahan. Let's assess before we intervene. She said nothing else. She followed them into Trauma Bay 1 and positioned herself where she could watch the monitor as the leads went on. The BP read 84/52, heart rate 128. She watched the respiratory waveform. Then she watched the patient's chest. The left side was moving less, not dramatically less, not the obvious asymmetry of a textbook case, but less. She'd seen this before. In a different country, in a different uniform, in conditions that made this trauma bay look like a spa. Ikat. Director Harlan Moss arrived in the ER at 8:07 a.m. That was the first sign that the patient was not an ordinary patient. Moss never came to the ER. He ran the hospital from the 4th floor, where his office had a view of the mountains and a Keurig machine and a door that was always mostly closed. His presence in the clinical areas was a quarterly performance, a walkthrough he did when the board was visiting or when a state inspection was coming. He came in with 2 men Emily didn't recognize. Civilian clothes, but they moved wrong for civilians, too deliberate, too aware of exits and angles. They peeled off to the waiting room. Moss came to the trauma bay window and looked in. The patient's BP had dropped again. 79/48. Brell had ordered a second unit of blood and was on the phone with the vascular surgery team, who were on their way from the 3rd floor. The charge nurse, Paula, was managing the IV lines. Another nurse was documenting vitals. The room was busy with the controlled motion of people doing their jobs, and to a casual observer it probably looked fine. Emily was watching the patient's trachea. It had shifted. Barely. Maybe 2 millimeters, the kind of shift that you didn't see if you weren't already looking for it, if you hadn't already run the logic, if you hadn't already decided what you were watching for before it happened. She went to Brell's elbow. His trachea has shifted. Left tension is building. We need to decompress now. Needle thoracostomy, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. We have maybe 3 minutes before his pressure collapses completely. Brell covered the phone with his hand. Ms. Callahan, I have surgery coming down. Surgery is 4 minutes away, and he doesn't have 4 minutes. That is not your call. He went back to the phone. She stood there for 2 seconds. She counted them. Then she turned toward the supply cart. The crash cart was already positioned. The needle thoracostomy supplies were in the second drawer from the top. She'd checked the supply locations her first week on the job because that was what you did. She was reaching for the drawer when she felt the hand on her arm. Step back. It was Moss. He'd come into the trauma bay, which he was not supposed to do without a clinical role. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed without needing to escalate. You are a floor nurse. You do not perform procedures in this trauma bay. I'm an ER nurse, and that patient is about to code. Step back, or I will have you removed. The monitor alarmed. One long, continuous tone. The patient's blood pressure dropped to 61/30. The SAT probe reading went from 94 to 88 in 12 seconds. Brell hung up the phone. Someone get me a needle. He needs decompression first, Emily said. She was already at the cart, already pulling the 14-gauge angiocath, already moving toward the patient's left side. Vascular can wait 30 seconds. He needs air out of that chest right now, or there's nothing to fix surgically. Don't, Moss started. Harlan. Brell's voice cut through it. He looked at Emily for one long moment. Not deferential, not convinced, just making a calculation about who was right and what the alternative was. Then he nodded, barely. Do it. She did it. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, angled correctly, the hiss of released air audible in the suddenly quiet trauma bay. It wasn't a dramatic sound. It never was. Just a hiss, a small mechanical correction. The SAT probe reading went from 88 to 92 in 8 seconds. BP, 74/40. Still low, still wrong, but the trajectory reversed. There's your tension, Emily said, not to anyone in particular. The surgery team came through the doors 40 seconds later. Mchubbed. She knew it wasn't over. She knew it even as the vascular surgeon took one look at the patient and started barking orders, even as the room reorganized itself around the intervention she'd already initiated, even as the monitor trended better and the blood pressure began its slow climb back to compatible with life. She knew it because Moss hadn't left the room. He was standing near the door, and his face had gone through 3 or 4 distinct phases in the last 90 seconds, and none of them were relief. He waited until the patient was being prepped for transport to the OR. Then he gestured at Emily with 2 fingers, the way you gesture at a dog. My office. Now. I'm on shift. You are not on anything. Paula. He looked at the charge nurse. Take over her patients. Paula didn't meet Emily's eyes. Nobody in the room did. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Emily didn't count them, but she knew, because she kept track of time as a habit, the way you kept track of things that might matter later. Moss sat behind his desk. He had a printed policy document in front of him, and he referenced it twice without actually reading from it, which told her the document was a prop. His argument wasn't about policy. His argument was about authority. You performed an invasive procedure without a physician order. Dr. Brell authorized it verbally. Dr. Brell was in a compromised situation and made a judgment error under pressure. The documentation will reflect that the procedure was initiated before authorization was given. She looked at him. That's not what happened. Ms. Callahan, I've been documenting your pattern of behavior for 3 months. Today's incident is the most serious in a series that includes repeated failure to follow chain of command, insubordination to attending physicians, and creating a disruptive clinical environment. He folded his hands. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending formal review. Please surrender your badge to HR. The patient is alive because of that intervention. The patient's outcome is a result of the surgical team's efforts. Your unauthorized action could have caused significant harm. She understood then that this wasn't a conversation. It hadn't been when she walked in. He'd probably written this version of events before she even sat down. She stood. She unclipped her badge and set it on his desk. "You're going to want that documentation to be accurate," she said. "Whatever you're planning to put in those records." He looked up at her. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm advising you." She left his office and walked to her locker and took out her bag. Her hands were steady. That still surprised her. She was in the elevator when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again immediately. She ignored it again. The elevator opened at the ground floor. She walked toward the main exit, past the information desk, past the gift shop with its rack of $9 greeting cards and its small stuffed animals. Security caught up with her at the lobby doors. "Ms. Callahan." It was a man named Doug, one of the day shift officers, who'd always been decent to her. He looked uncomfortable. "I've been asked to escort you out." "I'm already leaving, Doug." "I know, I have to walk with you." "Okay." They walked together toward the parking garage. The morning was cold, the kind of February cold that lived in your back and your hands, and she'd left her coat in her locker because she'd forgotten it in the mechanical process of collecting her things. She didn't go back for it. She was thinking about the patient's trachea, the 2mm shift, the way the hiss of air had sounded in that room. She was thinking about whether Brell would defend his verbal authorization or whether he'd let Moss reframe it, and she was running the odds, and the odds were not good, and she was calculating what that meant for her nursing license, and how long a formal review process would take, and whether she could... The sound hit her before she processed what it was. Rotors. She stopped walking. Doug stopped next to her. The helicopter, 2 of them, came in low over the hospital's west wing, their running lights visible in the pale morning sky. They weren't news helicopters. The profile was wrong, the approach angle was wrong, and civilian news helicopters didn't come in that tight or that fast. They landed in the parking lot. Not on the helipad. In the parking lot, the main visitor lot on the south side, which meant the pilots didn't care about protocol or property or the 6 cars they were displacing people from ever reaching again. They landed where they needed to land, and they did it in about 40 seconds. The doors opened before the rotors stopped. "What the—" Doug started. The men who came out were armed. Full kit. Body armor, communications gear, weapons holstered but visible. They moved with the particular efficiency of people who'd practiced this specific action enough times that it had become unconscious. They split into 2 groups. One group went toward the hospital entrance. The other came toward the parking garage. Toward her. She'd recognized this kind of movement before. She recognized it the way you recognized a language you'd learned a long time ago. Not consciously, but in your body, in the part of your brain that never fully came home. The man in front was an operator. She didn't know his face, but she knew his bearing, the way he held his posture, the way his eyes moved across an environment and cataloged it. He stopped in front of her. "Emily Callahan?" His voice was flat. Professional. "Yes." "We need you inside." Doug had stepped back. Doug was now approximately 6 feet to her left and looked like he was reconsidering every choice he'd made that had led him to this parking lot on this morning. "I've been suspended," Emily said. "Hospital administration just—" "Ma'am." The operator's voice didn't change. "The patient in your trauma bay. He's asking for you. He's the only one asking, and right now he is the only request that matters." He held the door open. "Please." She looked at him for 1 second. She looked at the helicopters and the team spreading through the parking lot and the men who'd gone inside ahead of them. "How bad is he?" "Alive. For now." She turned and walked back toward the entrance. Behind her, she heard Doug say something quietly. She didn't hear what it was. It didn't matter. What mattered was that somewhere inside Mercy Voss Medical Center, a man was asking for her by name. A man she hadn't seen in 4 years. A man whose file was classified. A man whose existence in this hospital meant that the morning had just become something none of them were prepared for. She walked faster. The operators fell into position around her, and the automatic doors slid open, and the hospital that had just finished removing her swallowed her back in. The lobby felt different with operators in it. It wasn't just the weapons or the tactical gear or the way 3 of them had positioned themselves at the main entrance without anyone telling them to. It was the atmosphere, the specific pressure of trained people taking ownership of a space, the way a room reorganizes itself around a new center of gravity. The volunteers at the information desk had gone quiet. A man in a visitor's badge was standing very still near the elevator bank, holding a coffee cup he'd forgotten to drink from. 2 nurses who'd been crossing the lobby had stopped mid-step and were doing that thing people do when they want to leave but don't want to look like they're leaving. Emily moved through all of it without slowing down. The operator, she still didn't have his name, stayed half a step to her left. He wasn't guiding her exactly, more like tracking her, the way a teammate tracks someone they've been told to keep alive. She noticed this and filed it without commenting on it. "What's his current status?" she asked as they hit the stairwell. "Out of surgery 40 minutes ago. Vascular team repaired the subclavian. He's in the ICU. He's conscious. He's been asking for you since he came around." "How long has he been asking?" "Since before surgery." She absorbed that. It meant he'd been asking in pre-op, which meant he'd been aware enough to ask, which meant the name had been deliberate. Not confusion, not medication, not the random verbal output of a man going under anesthesia. He'd asked for her knowing exactly what he was doing. "Who is he to you?" she said. The operator glanced at her sideways. "That's not my information to give." "Is it classified?" "Parts of it." "Which parts?" He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. They came out of the stairwell on the 3rd floor and turned left toward the ICU. 2 more operators were stationed outside the ICU doors, one on either side, parade rest, which looked almost absurd against the backdrop of a hospital hallway with its beige walls and motivational poster about hand hygiene. A charge nurse Emily recognized, a woman named Darla who'd always been civil to her, stood near the nursing station looking like she'd been told a great many things in the last 20 minutes and hadn't processed any of them yet. Darla saw Emily and her expression shifted through surprise, then something more complicated. "They won't let us in," Darla said. Her voice was low. "Our own ICU. They said the patient requested—" "I know," Emily said. "Emily, you were just suspended. Moss is going to—" "I know that too." She went to the ICU doors. The operator on the left looked at his counterpart, then stepped aside. The doors opened. The room was dim, the way ICU rooms were kept dim. Easier on patients post-anesthesia, softer on the monitoring equipment's glow. There were 2 men already inside besides the patient, one in military uniform, standing near the window with his arms crossed and his face neutral, and one in a suit that cost more than Emily's monthly rent, sitting in the chair beside the bed with a phone in his hand that he put down when she walked in. The man in the bed was named Garrett Winslow. She knew him. She'd known the moment the operator said, "He's asking for you." She'd run through the list of people from her previous life who would do exactly this, who would do it specifically, who would have the resources behind it, and the list had been short. She'd arrived at his name before they cleared the lobby. He looked worse than she'd expected and better than he had any right to. His color was gray-yellow under the fluorescent edge of the monitor light. He had a chest tube on the left side. She could see the flutter valve from where she stood, and 2 IVs running and a pulse ox on his right index finger. His eyes were open. They were the same dark, focused eyes she remembered from a forward operating base in the valley, from a situation she still wasn't legally allowed to describe in detail, from the night she'd spent 53 minutes keeping him alive with equipment that would have embarrassed a rural urgent care. He saw her, and something in his face settled. "Callahan," he said. His voice was rough, anesthesia, a tube that had been down his throat, the general trauma of the morning. But it was him. "Winslow." She moved to the bedside, checked the monitors without being obvious about it. BP was 102/68, which was low but viable. Heart rate 94, SATs at 96. "You look terrible." "I've been shot." "I noticed. You saved my life again." "I haven't done anything yet. The surgical team, before that, the needle." He coughed once, carefully, the way people coughed when they had a chest tube and knew better than to do it wrong. "The attending was going to wait. I could feel it going wrong." and then it stopped going wrong. She sat on the edge of the rolling stool near his bed. Who shot you? That's a long conversation for a different setting. Are you in danger here? Probably not. My people have the exits. He looked at her with that flat, evaluating look she remembered, the look of a man who made assessments faster than most people made observations. Are you in trouble? She almost laughed. My hospital director suspended me about 40 minutes ago. I was being walked out when your team found me. Something moved through his expression. Not quite anger, more precise than anger. Why? Because I kept being right when the attending was wrong, and that was inconvenient. He was quiet for a moment. The monitor beeped. Somewhere in the ICU, a different patient's alarm went off briefly and was silenced. Who's the director? Winslow said. Harlan Moss. He looked at the man in the suit. The man in the suit was already typing. Winslow, she started. You're not suspended, he said. It came out simply, the way he said most things simply, without drama, as if the declaration and the reality were already the same thing. My team is going to need access to you for the next several days minimum, and for that you need to be active hospital staff. That's not how hospital employment... Callahan, he looked at her. Do you trust me? She thought about the valley. She thought about 53 minutes. Yes. Then let me handle Moss. She didn't see what happened in Moss's office. She was in the ICU, managing Winslow's post-operative assessments, reviewing his chart, flagging two things she wanted the surgical team to look at, a drainage output she didn't like, and a temperature reading that was trending in the wrong direction. She was doing her job, and the doing of it was steadying in a way she hadn't expected, the familiar mechanical focus of clinical work settling her nervous system back into something functional. She heard about the meeting secondhand from Darla, who heard it from the OR charge nurse, who'd been walking past Moss's office when the voices got loud enough to penetrate the walls. What she gathered was this. 2 men from Winslow's team had gone to Moss's office at 9:30 a.m. They were not operators. They were the other kind, the kind in suits, which in some ways was more alarming. They had brought documentation. They had asked, apparently with great politeness and very little warmth, for Emily Callahan's suspension to be reversed, effective immediately, and for her access to be fully restored. They had mentioned several things that Emily didn't know the specifics of, but that Darla said had turned Moss's face a color that Darla described as the shade of old cheese. At 9:47 a.m., someone brought Emily's badge back to the ICU. Nobody explained it. The man who brought it, a young HR administrator named Fife, who always looked slightly overwhelmed, simply handed it to her with the expression of someone delivering a package they hadn't been told the contents of. Emily clipped it to her scrubs and went back to Winslow's chart. The complications started at 11. Not with Winslow. His numbers were holding, the drainage had leveled off, and the surgical team's morning consult had been cautiously optimistic, in the way surgical teams were cautiously optimistic when they didn't want to jinx anything. The complications started in the form of Dr. Wendell Pruitt appearing in the ICU doorway, with the particular posture of a man who'd decided he was going to reassert something. He was tall, silver-haired, with the practiced gravitas of someone who'd spent decades being the most senior person in every room he entered. He looked at the operators outside the ICU with the expression of a man who found them aesthetically unpleasant, but couldn't immediately identify grounds for removal. Then he looked at Emily. I need a word, he said. She followed him into the consultation room across the hall. He closed the door. He didn't sit. Harlan tells me your suspension has been reversed. The word came out like he'd tasted it and found it off. Under external pressure. That's my understanding. I want to be very clear about something. He faced her squarely, the way he faced residents when he was about to make a career-shaping point. The chain of command in this hospital has not changed. Whatever is happening with that patient, it does not override our clinical governance structure. You will still report to your charge nurse and the attending on duty. You will not perform procedures without explicit physician authorization. Do you understand? I understand that's what you want, Emily said. He blinked. It was a small blink, barely perceptible, but she'd learned to watch for small reactions in high-stakes environments. I beg your pardon? I understand that's what you want. I also understand that what happened in that trauma bay this morning was the correct intervention at the correct time, and that the patient in the ICU is alive partly because of it. She kept her voice level, not aggressive, not deferential, just clear. If a similar situation arises again, I'll make the same call. Then we have a problem. We might. She waited a beat. Or you could look at what actually happened and recalibrate. He stared at her. The room was very quiet. You are a nurse, he said, softly. The softness was the most dangerous part. Yes, she said. I am. She left the consultation room before he did. By noon, the hospital had developed the specific internal weather of an institution that knows something significant is happening but hasn't been told what. The rumors had started in the ER break room and migrated upward through every department in the building the way rumors always migrated, faster than official communications, distorted at each transmission point, accumulating detail that was half accurate and half invented. Emily heard several versions, that the patient was a senator, that the patient was a general, that the military had surrounded the hospital because of a bioterrorism threat, that the armed men were Secret Service, that they were private contractors, that Emily herself was some kind of undercover federal agent who'd been placed in the hospital 6 months ago. That last one almost made her smile. She stayed in the ICU. She managed Winslow's care, collaborated with the surgical and intensive care teams, ran interference on 2 separate occasions when physicians approached his room with an attitude suggesting they felt their access was being inappropriately restricted. She also called her sister at noon and got voicemail and left a message saying she was fine and would explain later, which was the kind of message her sister had learned over the years to interpret as something significant is happening, and I cannot tell you what. Winslow slept in the early afternoon. His vitals stabilized further. The drainage looked better. At 2:15, she stepped out of the ICU to eat something. She hadn't eaten since the coffee that morning, and found herself in the second-floor cafeteria with a sandwich she'd chosen without looking at it, sitting at a corner table by the window that looked out over the parking lot where the helicopters were still sitting. They'd been there 6 hours. Someone had cordoned off the area around them with orange traffic cones, which was the most normal thing that had happened all day. She was halfway through the sandwich when Dr. Brell sat down across from her. He was a man in his mid-40s with reading glasses he always wore pushed up on his forehead, and a way of sitting that communicated he was tired in a specific, chronic way. He set a coffee down and looked at her for a moment before speaking. I told Moss the verbal authorization was given, he said, for the record. I told him before you came back in, actually. She looked at him. Thank you. I want to be clear that I was uncertain in that moment, he said. I want to be clear that if you'd been wrong, it would have been very bad. I know. Were you afraid of being wrong? She thought about it honestly. Not in that moment. In that moment, there was just what needed to happen. He nodded slowly. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Where does that come from? That... He searched for the word. That certainty. It's not certainty, she said. It's just that at a certain point, the cost of waiting becomes higher than the cost of acting. You learn to feel where that line is. Where did you learn it? She looked at him for a moment. Somewhere else. He let that sit. He drank his coffee. Outside, the helicopter sat in the parking lot like enormous sleeping birds. Moss is not done, Brell said. He's regrouping. Whatever happened in his office this morning bought you today. Maybe tomorrow. But he's been in this hospital a long time and he doesn't let things go. I know, she said. Do you have documentation of any of it? Your own records, your own notes? I keep a personal log. She always had. The habit was military. You documented everything because the record was sometimes the only thing that survived. He nodded. Keep it current. He stood, picked up his coffee. And for what it's worth, what you did in that trauma bay was right. Clinically, procedurally, right. He paused. Even if I wasn't going to say that in front of Moss. He walked away. She finished the sandwich, which turned out to be turkey, and thought about what regrouping might look like for a man like Harlan Moss. She'd find out sooner than she expected. At 3:40 p.m., Winslow woke up again and asked to see her. She went in, and he was more alert this time, more color in his face, the post-surgical fog lifting. The man in the suit was back in the chair. The military officer, she'd learned he was a colonel, named Hargrove, was standing near the window again, which seemed to be his default position. "We need to talk about what's next," Winslow said. "Medically, you need—" "Not medically." He said it without dismissiveness. He just had very little interest in discussing his own fragility. "You're being targeted. I need to understand the scope before you can what?" He looked at her steadily. "Before my team can move appropriately." "Winslow." She kept her voice even. "I appreciate what you've done today. I do. But what's happening in this hospital is a workplace dispute. It's not whatever you're used to dealing with." "Is it?" He glanced at Hargrove. Hargrove uncrossed his arms. He had a tablet in his hand. She hadn't noticed it before. He held it out to her. On the screen was a document. She took the tablet and read the header. "An internal communication, sent this morning, time-stamped 8:54 a.m., 12 minutes after she'd left Moss's office. It was an email from Moss to Pruitt. The subject line was, Re Callahan, Documentation Strategy." She read it once, then she read it again. The email outlined, in specific and deliberate language, a plan to retroactively alter the timestamps on 2 incident reports, making it appear that Emily's interventions in the trauma bay had been unauthorized and after the fact rather than urgent and appropriate. It referenced conversations with the hospital's legal counsel. It referenced a prior incident from November, the cardiac patient, and indicated that Moss intended to reframe that documentation as well. The email ended with, "Once the board review is initiated, the narrative needs to be clean. She can't have grounds to dispute the record if the record is constructed correctly." Emily put the tablet down on the bed rail. The room was quiet. "Where did this come from?" she said. Hargrove took the tablet back. "We had reason to be in his system." "You had—" She stopped. "You were already investigating him." "We were investigating things adjacent to him," Winslow said. "Your situation became relevant when we arrived this morning and understood the context." He paused. "The email is 2 of 6 communications we've identified so far. The others are worse." She sat with that for a moment. The monitor beeped softly. Outside the ICU window, the sky had gone gray with afternoon cloud cover, the light flat and cold. "How long has he been doing this?" she said. "Altering records?" Winslow shook his head slightly. "This isn't the first time he's buried a complaint against a staff member. We're still mapping it, but it goes back at least 2 years, possibly further." "There were other people." "Yes." She thought about the other nurses she'd talked to in her 14 months at Mercy Voss. The ones who'd been careful, who'd been quiet, who'd told her in low voices in the break room to just go along with things. "It's not worth it. You'll understand eventually why it's not worth it." She'd thought they were beaten down. She hadn't thought about what had beaten them. "He's going to move tonight," Winslow said. "The board review, based on the communication with the legal counsel, he's planning to accelerate it. He knows he's in a difficult position, and he wants to cement the narrative before our presence here becomes more publicly known. And if he does? If he alters those records before we can secure them, it complicates things." He looked at her directly. "We need the originals." "Then you need to move first." "Yes." He let a beat pass. "Which is what I'm telling you we're going to do." "What?" She was back on the floor at 4:30. Winslow's team had asked her to maintain her normal presence, which meant staying visible and functional, which meant going back to her patients and her charts and the ordinary, relentless work of emergency nursing. She managed 4 patients in the ICU over the next 2 hours, coordinated with the attending on a potassium replacement order that needed adjusting, and managed 1 family member in the waiting room who'd been told very little and was reaching the limit of what very little could sustain. She did all of it with the email from Moss still sitting somewhere behind her eyes. The narrative needs to be clean. At 6:15, the afternoon shift charge nurse pulled her aside near the medication cart. Her name was Steph, early 30s, one of the few people at Mercy Voss who'd never treated Emily as either a problem or a novelty. "Something's happening in administration," Steph said quietly. Her voice had the careful neutrality of someone choosing their words. "Fife came through 20 minutes ago, white as paper. and Pruitt was called into Moss's office. Did anyone hear what about? Maria from Dietary said she saw two people she didn't recognize going into the medical records annex around 6 with a cart. Emily went still in the particular way she went still when information was arranging itself into a picture she didn't like. A cart. Like a file cart. And laptops. She didn't run. She walked at a pace that was slightly faster than usual, but wouldn't read as alarm to anyone watching, to the ICU. The operator outside was a different one than this morning. Younger, but the same bearing. She told him she needed to reach whoever was coordinating on Winslow's team. He spoke into his earpiece. 40 seconds later, the man in the suit came out of the ICU. She told him what she'd heard. His expression didn't change, which was itself a kind of reaction. How long ago, he said. 20 minutes, maybe. He spoke into his own earpiece. She caught 2 words before he turned away. Records Annex. What happened next, she pieced together over the following hour from fragments, from what she observed directly, from what the operators communicated to each other in clipped exchanges she was close enough to hear, from what Steph reported seeing from the hallway near the administrative wing. 4 members of Winslow's team moved to the medical records annex at 6:23 p.m. They encountered 2 individuals in the process of accessing and removing documentation from filing systems, both physical and electronic. One of the 2 individuals was a man named Gerald Swick, Mercy Voss's records compliance officer, who was supposed to control access to exactly the kind of files he was in the process of moving. The other was a person from legal counsel's office whose name Emily never learned. Both of them were detained, but not arrested, not yet, but detained, which in practice meant they were sitting in the annex with 2 operators and nobody's phone was working, and Swick had apparently tried to explain twice that he was acting under administrative directive, and both times received the same response, which was silence. The records were secured. Moss didn't know this yet. That was the part that mattered. At 7:05 p.m., Moss sent an email to the board chair requesting an emergency review meeting for the following morning. The email cited ongoing personnel concerns and the need to clarify institutional liability. Emily knew about this email because Winslow's team had already been monitoring Moss's outgoing communications, a detail that she was deliberately not thinking too hard about. At 7:18, she was at the nurse's station writing a care note when her phone buzzed. Unknown number again. This time she answered. Ms. Callahan. The voice was male, unfamiliar, with the kind of precise diction that came from law school or military officer training, or both. My name is Warren Aldis. I'm the lead investigator for a federal review that is currently active regarding Mercy Voss Medical Center. You may have become aware in the last several hours that certain things are in motion. Yes, she said. We'd like to schedule a formal interview at your convenience, tonight, if possible. She looked at the nurse's station clock. 7:19. How formal, she said. Formal enough that you should probably call an attorney first. Her stomach went tight. Am I a subject? No. His voice was even. You're a witness. Possibly our most important one, but you should still have representation present. He paused. We've been aware of your situation at this hospital for some time, Ms. Callahan, longer than you might expect. Before she could respond to that, before she could ask what longer than you might expect meant, how long, what they knew and when they'd known it, the door to the administrative wing at the end of the hallway opened. Harlan Moss came out. He was moving quickly, his face arranged in the controlled blankness of a man suppressing something significant. Behind him was Pruitt. Behind Pruitt were 2 people she didn't recognize. And behind all of them, in the unhurried way of someone who didn't need to hurry because the situation was already contained, came the man in the suit from Winslow's room. Moss saw Emily at the nurse's station. Their eyes met. He'd already figured out what had happened to his records. She could see it in his face, the way his jaw was set, the way his eyes went from her to the man in the suit and back to her again. And in that 2-second exchange, she understood that he was connecting the dots he'd refused to see all morning. The badge returned, the suspension reversed, the operators, the helicopters, the woman he'd been trying to quietly eliminate for 3 months, who was somehow at the center of all of it. He looked at her like she was something he'd catastrophically underestimated. She held his gaze and didn't move. Then Pruitt touched Moss's arm and said something quiet, and Moss looked away, and the group moved toward the elevator, and Emily stood at the nurse's station with her phone still in her hand, and Warren Aldis's voice still waiting on the other end of the line. "Miss Callahan," Aldis said, "are you still there?" "Yes," she said. "I'm here. Can we meet?" She watched the elevator doors close behind Harlan Moss. She thought about the email. The narrative needs to be clean. She thought about the file card in the records annex, the two people sitting in a room with operators, the records that were already secured, the things that had been in motion longer than she'd known. She thought about the nurse who'd been told for 3 months to stay in her lane. "Yes," she said. "Tell me where." But before Aldis could answer, she heard footsteps coming fast from the direction of the ICU. Not running, but close, the deliberate quick stride of someone delivering news that couldn't wait. And the young operator who appeared in the hallway had his hand to his earpiece and his eyes on her. "Ms. Callahan." His voice was tight in a way that the other operators' voices hadn't been all day. "Mr. Winslow needs you." His pressure just dropped. She was already moving. She got to the ICU in 40 seconds. The monitors told her the story before anyone in the room did. BP at 78/44, heart rate climbing toward 118, the arterial line waveform flattening in the specific way that meant the vascular system was losing its argument with physics. Winslow was awake. That was something. But his color had gone wrong again, that grayish yellow she'd seen in the trauma bay, and his breathing had the shallow, working quality of a man whose body was spending energy it didn't have. The ICU attending on duty was Dr. Sonia Ryath, a woman in her late 40s who'd been running critical care at Mercy Voss for 6 years and who Emily had only spoken to 3 times but had assessed as competent and direct. Wraith was already at the bedside, already reading the numbers, already running the differential out loud in the clipped shorthand of someone who thought better when she heard herself think. Pressure dropped 12 minutes ago. Gradual at first, then faster. Could be rebleed. Could be vasovagal response to pain. Could be cardiac tamponade developing. Drainage output? Emily asked. Increased in the last hour, 40 cubic centimeters more than the previous. Emily looked at the chest tube. The fluid in the collection chamber was darker than it should have been. This isn't vasovagal, the drainage color changed. Could still be surgical site bleeding, contained, or it's not contained. Emily checked the monitor again. The pulse pressure was narrowing, systolic dropping, diastolic creeping up. Beck's triad. Check his heart sounds. Wraith already had her stethoscope out. She listened. 30 seconds of quiet in a room that didn't have quiet in it. "Muffled," Wraith said. "Tamponade." The word landed in the room like a door slamming. Colonel Hargrove, who'd been standing near the window throughout, straightened. The operator near the door took a half step forward before catching himself. Wraith looked at Emily. Not the way she'd looked at her before, not the careful professional look of an attending acknowledging a nurse's input while retaining the right to discard it. This was a different look. Shorter, more direct. "You're right. We need echo confirmation, and we need cardiothoracic now. Echo's going to take time we might not have." Emily was already calculating. BP dropping, pulse pressure narrowing, muffled sounds, elevated drainage. The clinical picture was assembled. Waiting for imaging to confirm what the numbers were already saying was a choice with a price. Pericardiocentesis, or we open his chest. He just came out of vascular surgery 8 hours ago. "I know." Wraith made the call in about 4 seconds, which Emily respected. "Get me cardiothoracic on the phone, get echo in here, and get a pericardiocentesis tray." She looked at Emily. "Stay." Emily stayed. The next 22 minutes were the worst kind of controlled chaos. The kind where everyone in the room was doing exactly what they were supposed to do, and it still felt like the situation was outpacing them. The echo tech arrived in 6 minutes, which was fast, and confirmed the pericardial effusion in 3, which was faster, and the image on the screen showed fluid around the heart's outer sac compressing the chambers in exactly the pattern that the numbers had predicted. The cardiothoracic surgeon on call was a Dr. Olafs, a man Emily had never met, who came in from the hallway still pulling on his gloves and assessed the echo image in about 8 seconds and said, "We're draining it here now before he goes to the OR," which was the right call, and then looked at the room and said, "Who identified this?" Wraith nodded toward Emily. Olafs looked at her, said nothing, but the look was the kind of look that registered. The pericardiocentesis was a procedure Emily had done exactly twice in her life, both times in the field, both times in conditions that made this ICU look like a controlled environment. She wasn't performing it now. Olafs was. But she was in the room. She was monitoring the echo in real time as the needle went in under ultrasound guidance, and when Olaf said, "Talk to me on the echo," she talked to him. Needle tip visible, approaching the effusion. You're clear of the ventricular wall. Advance 2 more millimeters. The fluid came out dark. A lot of it. 40 cubic centimeters in the first draw, then more as the catheter was secured and the drainage began. The monitor changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the arterial waveform opened back up. The pulse pressure widened. The BP climbed from 78 to 89 to 96 in the space of 4 minutes. Heart rate came down from 118 to 104. Winslow exhaled. It was a sound with a lot of things in it. "Still needs the OR," Olaf said. He was taping the catheter down, efficiently, without looking up. "Source of that bleed has to be identified and controlled. But we bought him time." He stripped his gloves. "Good catch." He said it without ceremony. Then he was on his phone to the OR team, and the room was reorganizing around the next phase. Emily stood at the foot of the bed. Her hands were at her sides. She was aware that they were not shaking, which was a thing she noticed the same way she'd been noticing it all day, with the mild, distant curiosity of someone monitoring a data point. Winslow's eyes found her across the room. "Still here," she said. "Still here," he agreed. His voice was very tired. He went to the OR at 8:40 p.m. She watched the transport team wheel him out and stood in the empty ICU room for a moment afterward, looking at the impression his body had left in the bed, the monitors still running their empty rhythms, the pericardiocentesis tray on the side cart with its dark-stained materials. Then she went to wash her hands and find a place to sit for 5 minutes. She found the family consultation room on the 3rd floor empty and sat in one of the upholstered chairs that hospitals bought because they were supposed to be comforting and that were never actually comfortable. She'd forgotten about Warren Aldis and his phone call until her phone buzzed again. A text this time, just a number and a room designation. "Room 114, ground floor, when you're ready." She texted back, "1 hour." Then she sat in the chair and let herself be still for a few minutes, which was different from going still in the clinical way. This was just stopping, letting the day catch up enough to be acknowledged before being set aside again. 14 months of careful work, of doing her job correctly, and being made to feel like the correctness itself was the problem. 3 formal write-ups, the email, the file cart in the records annex, a man who'd been shot and then bled into his pericardium and was now in surgery again while a federal investigator waited for her in a room on the ground floor. She was tired. That was human, and she let herself feel it for exactly as long as she was sitting in the chair. Then she got up. Room 114 was a conference room that Mercy Voss used for vendor meetings and the occasional departmental retreat, with a rectangular table and 8 chairs and a whiteboard on one wall that still had a half-erased revenue projection from some previous meeting. Warren Aldis was there, with a woman he introduced as Special Agent Devra Osei of the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division, and a second man whose name Emily didn't catch because he was already sliding a document across the table before Aldis had finished introductions. She looked at the document. It was a consent form for a voluntary interview. She read it fully, which Osei seemed to approve of based on the small shift in her posture. "You mentioned you'd known about my situation longer than I might expect," Emily said. "I'd like to understand that before we start." Aldis nodded. He had the careful manner of someone who'd learned to answer questions without lying and without giving more than was asked. "We've been investigating Mercy Voss's records practices for approximately 8 months. Your name came up in that investigation not as a subject but as a pattern. Someone whose documentation kept conflicting with the administrative record. The discrepancies were notable. You were watching Moss." We were watching a pattern of behavior that Moss was central to, yes. For 8 months. She let that land. And you didn't... She stopped herself before the rest of it came out, because the rest of it was do anything, and she understood from 6 years of working adjacent to federal operations that the timing of intervention was never as simple as it looked from outside. We needed the full picture, Osei said. Her voice was direct without being cold. Moving prematurely would have let him bury it. Emily thought about the nurses who'd been careful and quiet. She thought about 2 years, possibly further. She set that aside because she needed to focus. What do you need from me? Your account of every clinical incident during your tenure at this hospital where your documentation conflicted with the final administrative record. Your personal log, if you're willing to provide it. And your account of today. All of it? All of it you can give us. She gave them 3 hours. She was precise and methodical, and she went chronologically because that was how she'd learned to report. From the beginning, in order, without editorializing, letting the sequence speak. Osei took notes. Aldous asked clarifying questions. The third man recorded. At one point, about 90 minutes in, Osei said, "The cardiac patient. November. Walk me through that." Emily walked her through it. At the end of it, Osei put down her pen and looked at her. "That patient's readmission. Did you file an incident report?" "Yes." "We have a version of that incident report. The timestamp has been modified. The language in the original as you filed it differs significantly from what's in the system now." Emily had known this intellectually, from the email, from what Winslow's team had told her. Hearing it stated plainly by a federal agent was different. "How significantly?" Osei slid a document across the table. 2 versions of the same report, side by side. Emily read the altered version. Her name was there, her signature block, the date. But the language had been reversed, the sequence rearranged, the clinical concern she'd raised reframed as an administrative note about chain of command. It read like a complaint about a disruptive employee. It read nothing like what she'd written. She looked at it for a long time. "How many?" she finally said. "Reports altered?" "Yes." Osei glanced at Aldous. Something passed between them. 14 confirmed so far. Across 6 employees in the last 2 years. You're the most recent. 14. 6 people. The chair she was sitting in suddenly felt more solid, or maybe she felt less solid, one or the other. She thought about the other 5. She thought about what those altered records meant for them, whether they'd found other jobs, whether their licenses were intact, whether they'd ever understood what had actually happened to their documentation. "Are they... the other 5... We're reaching out," Aldous said. "That process is beginning." She nodded. She put the document back on the table. Outside the conference room, the hospital had gone to its night mode, quieter, sparser, the fluorescent lights on the reduced overnight schedule. Someone walked past the door. A cart with a squeaky wheel went down the hallway. She was about to ask about next steps when her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at the screen. It was Steph, the charge nurse, still on shift, texting from the floor. "You need to see this. 3rd floor admin hallway. Now." She looked at Aldous. "I need a few minutes." He looked at the text. He couldn't read it at that angle, and he didn't try. "We're nearly done. Can it wait?" Her phone buzzed again. "Steph. Moss is up there with 2 board members. They have paperwork. Emily. I think they're trying to push the board review through tonight." She stood up. "No," she said. "It can't." "Chat." She took the stairs 2 at a time. The 3rd floor administrative hallway was a different environment than the clinical floors. Carpeted, dimmer, the institutional quiet of office space after hours. She came out of the stairwell and saw them immediately. Moss, and 2 people she recognized as board members from the hospital's lobby portrait wall, a woman named Patricia Vell and a man named Douglas Hearn, both of whom had the expression of people who'd been called somewhere urgently and were not entirely sure the urgency was justified. Steph was near the elevator, pretending to check something on her phone. Moss had a folder. He was speaking in the controlled, measured tone he used when he was presenting a narrative he'd constructed rather than describing something that had happened. He saw Emily come out of the stairwell, and something in his expression went very carefully blank. "Ms. Callahan," he said, This is an administrative meeting. You're not Mr. Moss. The voice came from behind her. She turned. Warren Aldis was there. He must have come up the other stairwell. He'd moved faster than she'd expected, or anticipated the destination. Osei was with him, and behind them, in the particular unhurried way he moved everywhere, was the man in the suit from Winslow's team. Moss looked at the three of them. He looked at the folder in his own hand. He looked at Patricia Vell, who was looking at the federal credentials Aldis had produced from his jacket pocket and showing her with the quiet efficiency of someone who did this frequently. Douglas Hearn took a step back. "I don't understand what's happening," Vell said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was effortful. "Ms. Vell," Aldis said, "I apologize for the hour. My name is Warren Aldis, and I'm the lead investigator for an active federal review of this institution's records management practices." He looked at Moss. "Mr. Moss, I'm going to need that folder." Moss held it for 1 second longer than he should have. Then he handed it over. Aldis looked through it. His expression didn't change, but Osei, reading over his shoulder, made a small sound that wasn't quite anything, just an involuntary reaction to something on the page. Emily didn't know what was in the folder. She found out later, much later, when the documents became part of the public record of the proceedings, that it had contained a pre-written board resolution terminating her employment and a summary document intended to represent the full administrative record of her performance concerns, a document that had been constructed almost entirely from altered reports. What she knew in that hallway, in that moment, was the look on Harlan Moss's face. It was the look of a man who had been building something for a long time, carefully, methodically, brick by brick, and had just watched someone remove the foundation. Aldis looked up from the folder. "Mr. Moss, I'm going to ask you to come downstairs with us." He said it calmly, with a specific politeness that had more authority in it than any raised voice. "There are some things we need to discuss." Moss turned to the board members. He was looking for something in their faces. Support, or at least neutrality, or at least the benefit of the doubt they'd always extended to him before. Patricia Vell had her arms crossed. Douglas Hearn was studying the carpet. He didn't find what he was looking for. He turned back to Aldis and said, "I want my attorney present." "Of course," Aldis said. "You're entitled to that. We can wait." He went with them. He walked down the hallway toward the elevator with Aldis on one side and Osei on the other, and the folder under Aldis's arm, and he walked with his back straight and his face blank, and Emily watched him go. Steph appeared at her elbow. "What just happened?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," Emily said, which was honest. Vell and Hearn were still in the hallway. Vell looked at Emily with an expression that was complicated, something between professional assessment and the particular discomfort of someone realizing they'd been operating on bad information for a significant period of time. "Ms. Callahan," she said. Her voice was careful. "I think the board is going to need a significant briefing." "I think that's right," Emily said. Hearn cleared his throat. "The suspension, effective as of today, it was already reversed this morning," Emily said, "under separate circumstances." She paused. "But I appreciate you noting it." She left them in the hallway and went back to the stairwell. She needed to check on Winslow. She needed to know if he was out of surgery. She needed to do about 12 other things in the next hour, and she needed to do all of them while the adrenaline from the last 30 minutes subsided into something manageable. She was on the second step down when her phone rang. Olaf's, the cardiothoracic surgeon. She answered. "Yes." "Mr. Winslow is out of surgery." His voice was tired but not alarmed. "We found a small dehiscence at the vascular repair site. That was your source. It's closed. He's stable." She exhaled. "Good work tonight," Olaf said. It came out roughly, like a man who didn't say that kind of thing often and hadn't entirely meant to say it now. He hung up before she could respond. She stood on the stairwell step for a moment. The fluorescent light above her hummed. Somewhere above her, Moss was in an elevator with federal investigators. Somewhere above that, in the OR recovery suite, Winslow was breathing. She'd been suspended this morning. It felt like it had happened to someone else in another building a long time ago. She was halfway down the stairs when the text came in. Not from Steph this time. Not from Aldous or Osei. From a number she didn't have saved in her contacts, but the area code was right, and the message was 3 sentences long. "This is Colonel Hargrove. Mr. Winslow asked me to relay something before he went under. He said, 'Tell her there's more she doesn't know yet. The investigation into this hospital, the records, the fraud, it connects to something larger. She's going to want to be prepared.'" She stared at the screen. Something larger. The stairwell was very quiet. The hum of the light. Her own breathing. She typed back, "How much larger?" 3 dots appeared. Then they disappeared. Then they appeared again. Then the response came through, and Emily Callahan stood on the stairs of Mercy Voss Medical Center and read it again, and understood that what she'd thought was the end of something was nowhere near the end of anything. Hargrove's message was 4 words. Larger than this hospital. She stood on the stairs and read it 3 more times. Not because the words were ambiguous, but because her mind needed to cycle through them enough times to accept what they implied. She typed back, "Explain." The 3 dots appeared, and then Hargrove's response came in 2 parts, separated by about 20 seconds. Moss wasn't acting alone in the broader sense. Records alteration at Mercy Voss was being used to suppress whistleblower complaints that intersected with a federal procurement investigation. Medical equipment contracts. The complaints he buried here, but 3 of them, were about vendor relationships that connected upward. Then, Winslow was here because of the procurement investigation, not because of you. You were the collision point. She put her phone in her pocket and finished walking down the stairs. The collision point. She turned the phrase over as she moved through the hospital's ground floor, past the dimmed lobby, past the gift shop's closed metal gate, toward the ICU on the 2nd floor where she needed to be. She understood what it meant practically. She hadn't been the reason the operators came. She'd become the reason they stayed. There was a difference, and it mattered, not to her ego, because her ego had never been particularly invested in being the center of anything, but to the geometry of what was happening, to understanding the actual shape of it. Moss had been suppressing complaints, 3 of them, specifically. And at least some of those complaints had touched something much larger than a hospital director protecting his territory. She needed to talk to Aldous. She also needed to sleep, at some point. She noted this as a practical fact and set it aside. Winslow was in the post-surgical recovery suite by the time she found Hargrove, who was standing in the hallway outside with the same posture he'd maintained in every hallway all day. Arms crossed, back to the wall, aware of every entry point. It was past 10. The hallway had the particular silence of a hospital at night, that specific absence of ambient noise that made everything that did occur sound slightly too loud. "He's stable," Hargrove said before she could ask. "I know. Olaf's called." She stopped in front of him. "The procurement investigation, how long has it been running?" "That's not my brief." "Does Aldous know about the connection to Moss?" Something in Hargrove's expression shifted. "Not much. They know more than they've told you." "I got that impression." She looked at him steadily. "Is Winslow's presence here? The shooting. Is that connected? Not coincidence?" Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere a cartwheel squeaked in the distance. "We're still assessing that," he said, which was not the same as no. She thought about the man in the expensive suit who'd been sitting in Winslow's room all day. She thought about the way Aldous had moved so quickly to the 3rd-floor hallway, anticipating where Moss would go. She thought about Hargrove's text, the timing of it, the precision of the 4 words. "How long have you been running parallel to the federal investigation?" she said. Hargrove's expression moved again. This time something that might have been respect, or might have been the specific look of a person recalibrating how much to say. "Long enough?" "And Moss? Did he know about Winslow's connection to the procurement case?" "We believe so. Yes." "Then the records alteration wasn't just about protecting his position at this hospital." "No," Hargrove said. "It wasn't." She let the full weight of that settle. 14 altered records, 6 employees, a man who'd been shot and bled twice and was now recovering from his 2nd surgery in 12 hours. And underneath all of it, a thread that ran somewhere she hadn't seen yet, connected to contracts and money and the specific kind of institutional corruption that required documentation management because the documentation was the evidence. "I need to be in that interview with Aldous," she said. "The full version, not just my account of my own situation." "That's Aldous's call." "Then tell me where he is." Aldous was in a ground floor conference room that was not room 114. He'd moved, which told her something about how the evening had developed. He was on the phone when she came in, and he held up one finger without looking at her, which was the universal gesture for, "I see you and I'll be with you in a moment," and finished the call in about 40 seconds. When he put the phone down, his face had the flat, carefully neutral expression of a man processing a great deal of information and not yet ready to organize it for an outside audience. "Hargrove told you," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down." She sat. "What I'm about to tell you is part of an active federal investigation, and I'm telling you because your cooperation is material to it, and because, frankly, given what you've already done today, withholding it would be counterproductive." He folded his hands on the table. Mercy Voss Medical Center has had a purchasing relationship with a medical supply company called Viridian Integrated Systems for the past 4 years. That relationship involved a series of contracts totaling approximately $42 million over that period. Emily said nothing. She waited. "In the course of a separate investigation, we identified anomalies in how those contracts were awarded. Specifically, evidence suggesting that bids from other vendors were suppressed, documentation altered or withheld to ensure Viridian received preferential treatment. 3 employees at this hospital over the course of 2 years filed internal complaints raising concerns about the procurement process. Those complaints were documented, and then those documents were altered. By Moss. With Moss's direct involvement, Swick handled the technical execution, the actual record manipulation. Moss directed it and provided the cover narrative." Aldous paused. "The employees who filed the complaints were subsequently subject to performance reviews that resulted in 2 terminations and 1 forced resignation. The documentation supporting those reviews was constructed," Emily said. "Yes." She thought about the nurses who'd been careful and quiet. She was now looking at them through a different lens, and the picture was worse than it had been. "Viridian," she said. "Who owns it?" Aldous looked at her steadily. "That's the part of the investigation we're still actively developing. But there's a name." "There are several names. One of them is a person with significant institutional connections who had reason to want certain information, specifically concerns about procurement irregularities at hospitals in this region, suppressed before it could reach federal oversight channels." She understood then why Winslow had been shot, or why Hargrove thought he might have been. Winslow had been investigating something adjacent. He'd gotten close to a thread that someone wanted kept untouched, and he'd ended up in a trauma bay in a hospital where the director had been managing the suppression end of the same operation, the collision point. "Moss knew who Winslow was," she said, "when he came in this morning. We believe Moss received a communication identifying the patient within approximately 20 minutes of the ambulance arrival," Aldous said. "His decision to escalate the situation with you, the suspension, the documentation strategy, we think that was partly reactive. He was trying to control the clinical environment around a patient he had reason to want to," Aldous chose the word carefully, "minimize access to." The room was very quiet. "He was trying to make sure Winslow didn't receive optimal care," she said. Aldous didn't answer. He didn't have to. She sat with that for a full 10 seconds. It was the ugliest version of the day she'd been in, and she'd been in a fairly ugly day. "The needle thoracostomy," she said. "If I hadn't pushed for it—" "We're not going to speculate," Aldous said firmly. "What we know is that the intervention happened, the patient survived, and the clinical record supports your account at every point." He opened a folder. "What I need from you now is your recollection of Moss's specific actions in the trauma bay. His physical location, what he said, the sequence. We have video from the hospital's surveillance system. We secured that this afternoon, but we need verbal corroboration." She gave it to him. All of it. She gave it in the same methodical sequence she'd given him everything else, and this time she noted the details she hadn't emphasized before. The way Moss had physically intervened, his hand on her arm, the specific words he'd used, the fact that he'd come into the trauma bay without a clinical role, which was a protocol violation that nobody had flagged because nobody had been looking at him. Osei was writing steadily. The recorder was running. At the end, Aldous closed his folder. "Thank you." "What happens to Moss?" she said. "That's not a question I can answer tonight." "I know. I'm asking anyway." He looked at her. "The records tampering alone is a federal offense. Given the connection to the procurement fraud, the charges will compound significantly." He paused. "He will not be returning to this hospital." She got to Winslow's recovery room at 11:40 p.m. He was awake. Barely. The specific, hovering wakefulness of someone on post-surgical analgesia who was fighting the sedation on principle. His color was better than it had been all day. The monitor showed numbers that were still not good, but were trending in a direction that meant he was going to wake up tomorrow. She pulled a chair to the bedside and sat. "You look tired," he said. His voice was thick. "You've been shot and had 2 surgeries." "Not a competition." He tried to shift in the bed, winced, stopped. "Hargrove told you." "Yes." "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I needed to be sure you were—" "I understand. I've been watching this investigation develop for 8 months." He closed his eyes for a moment, opened them again. "When I ended up here, of all the hospitals, I thought it was random. The attack happened on Route 9. Mercy Voss was closest. But it wasn't random. The people we think were responsible knew where I'd be, knew the route. Route 9 to Mercy Voss, they would have known where the ambulance was going." He breathed carefully. "Sending me here specifically to the hospital where the director was managing the suppression operation, whether that was intentional or coincidental, is still—" He stopped, recalibrated. "Hargrove thinks it was intentional. A message. Or an opportunity, depending on how long they'd been planning it." He looked at her. "The fact that you were here, that you did what you did, that it ended this way rather than the other way." He stopped again. The medication was pulling at him. "That's not a small thing." "Get some rest," she said. "Callahan." His eyes were heavier now. "The 5 other employees, the ones he buried." "I know. Aldous is reaching out. Make sure they understand what happened, the real version." His voice was fading. "People deserve to know when the record lied about them." "I'll make sure," she said. He was asleep within 2 minutes. She sat for a while after, watching the monitor, listening to the steady quiet of the room. The morning came faster than it should have. She slept 4 hours in the on-call room that Wraith had, without announcement, simply unlocked for her at midnight, leaving the key on the nurse's station counter. She woke at 5 a.m., showered in the small attached bathroom, and came back to the floor. The hospital at 5 a.m. had a specific texture. The changeover of night and morning staff, the particular quality of light from windows that were beginning to register the sky outside, the energy of a building that was about to shift modes. She'd always liked this time, even when she was exhausted. There was something honest about it. Steph was still on. She'd pulled a double, apparently, with the specific stubbornness of someone who wanted to see how the night had resolved. "Board called an emergency meeting for 7 a.m., Steph said, handing her a coffee. "Nobody's told us officially what it's about, but the admin assistant posted a meeting notice and it said, Institutional Governance Review, which means they know," Emily said. "The whole building knows, or thinks it knows. There are 3 different versions of what happened circulating and none of them are completely right." She paused. "Are you okay?" Emily drank the coffee. "I'm okay. Moss isn't in the building. Pruitt isn't in the building. Swick was escorted out last night and nobody's seen him since." "I know." 6 people, Emily." Steph's voice dropped. "He did this to 6 people. Tamara from respiratory therapy. She resigned 18 months ago. She thought she'd failed a performance review. She left nursing over it." Emily set her coffee down. "I know." "That's on him." "Yes, it is." She meant to say more, but there wasn't more to say that the situation hadn't already said. She picked up her coffee and her clipboard and went to start her morning assessments. The board meeting happened at 7 a.m. and ran for 2 hours and 40 minutes, which she knew because she could see the conference room lights on from the second-floor hallway, and Darla, who had a particular talent for proximity to institutional information, reported the duration with precision. What happened inside, Emily only knew in pieces at first and fully later, when the board's external communications team released a statement that was careful and legally hedged, and nonetheless communicated the essential facts. Harlan Moss had been placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending federal and internal investigation. Gerald Swick had been terminated. 3 other administrative staff members had been suspended pending review. The board had retained external legal counsel and had initiated an independent audit of all personnel documentation for the past 3 years. The statement was 2 paragraphs. It named no charges. It referenced the federal investigation obliquely. It thanked patients and staff for their patience during an ongoing process. Emily read it in the break room at 9:30 a.m. while eating a granola bar she'd found in her bag and hadn't remembered putting there. The break room had 4 other nurses in it, all reading the same statement on their respective phones, all quiet with the specific quiet of people absorbing something significant. One of the nurses, a man named Phil, who'd been at Mercy Voss for 9 years, and who had never been anything but minimally civil to Emily, looked up from his phone and looked at her. "Is it true," he said, "that they altered the records?" "Yes," she said. He looked back at his phone. Then he said quietly, "Tamara, from respiratory." "Yes?" He didn't say anything else. He put his phone in his pocket and went back to the floor. Emily watched him go and thought about the long, slow accumulation of institutional silences, all the moments when someone had noticed something wrong and calculated that noticing wasn't worth it. Patricia Vell found her at 10:15. Vell was one of the 2 board members who'd been in the hallway the night before. In daylight, in the clinical environment, she had the slightly uncomfortable energy of a person who made her living in boardrooms and was aware that this was different terrain. She asked if Emily had a few minutes. Emily had patients to check on and said 10. They stood in the consultation room on the 3rd floor, the same one where Pruitt had lectured her the morning before, which was a geography that Emily noted without commenting on. "I want to be direct," Vell said. She had her arms at her sides, which Emily recognized as a posture people adopted when they wanted to signal they weren't hiding anything. The board was not aware of the documentation practices. I want to be clear that that is not a defense of the board's oversight processes, which clearly need to be examined, but we were not aware. "I understand that," Emily said. "We've been receiving a picture of you, of your performance, your compliance, your professional conduct that was constructed." Vell said the last word with the particular care of someone who'd talked to lawyers that morning. "What you've done clinically over 14 months at this institution, and specifically in the last 24 hours, is the gap between what we were told and what is documented in the actual clinical record is significant." "Yes," Emily said. "It is. We'd like to discuss your continued role here, formally. Once the audit process has—" "I'm not going anywhere," Emily said, not combatively, just as a statement of fact. "I have patients, and I'm going to take care of them." Vell looked at her. Something in the boardroom posture shifted. "Of course," she said. Emily went back to the floor. Winslow was transferred out of the recovery suite and back to the ICU at noon. He was more alert, the post-surgical fog lifting properly now that he was past the immediate crisis. His vitals were holding. The chest tube output had dropped to a trickle. Olafs did his consult at 12:30 and used the word encouraging twice, which was the most optimistic word in a surgeon's vocabulary. She was reviewing his afternoon meds when Aldous appeared in the ICU doorway and caught her attention with a slight movement of his head. She went out. "Moss gave a statement this morning," Aldous said. His voice was level in the way it had been level all through the previous night, the professional flatness of someone managing a great deal of information and deliberate about what he showed. "To the board?" "To our investigators." His attorney was present. Aldous paused. He's trying to position himself as a partial cooperator, claiming he was acting under direction from above. "From where above?" "That's what we're developing." Aldous looked at her directly. The name he gave us, in the context of the procurement investigation, is someone with significant regional institutional influence. We're not releasing the name yet, but if his account holds and the corroborating documentation holds, what started as a records falsification investigation is going to become something significantly more complex. Larger than this hospital, she said. Yes. He paused. He also made a statement about you specifically. He claimed that your clinical interventions were part of a pattern of deliberate disruption, that you were creating crises to demonstrate competence. She looked at him. That's what he said. Yes. And the video from the trauma bay shows exactly what you described. He said it simply. His account is not supported by the evidence. We told him that. He paused again. He didn't enjoy hearing it. She imagined that was true. She thought about a man who'd spent 2 years carefully constructing a version of events and was now watching the construction come apart in real time, piece by piece, in a federal interview room with his attorney beside him. She thought about the 5 other people. She thought about Tamara from respiratory therapy, who'd left nursing over a performance review that had never been real. What happens to the altered records, she said. The ones for the other employees. They become part of the investigation record. Eventually, after the legal process, there will be mechanisms for those employees to access documentation of what was done to their files. He paused. It's not fast, and it doesn't fully... I know, she said. It doesn't undo it. No, he agreed. It doesn't. She went back to the ICU. She checked Winslow's drainage one more time. She reviewed the afternoon chart notes and added 2 observations of her own. She managed 3 other patients on the floor. At 3 p.m. She was at the nurses' station when Darla came from the direction of the administrative wing with the specific energy of someone carrying significant news. The audit team is here, Darla said. External. They came in an hour ago and they're in the medical records department with 3 people from the federal investigation. And the board just posted something on the internal network. Emily looked at the internal communications board on the computer at the station. The post was brief and institutional in its language, but its content was not. Effective immediately, all personnel documentation for staff members subject to formal review actions in the period of January 2023 through the present will be subject to independent audit. Staff members wishing to provide testimony regarding their experiences of the review process may contact the external audit team directly. All such contact is confidential and will be handled by the external team independent of hospital administration. Below the post, there was contact information, an external email, a direct phone number. Darla looked at Emily. Is this because of you? It's because of what he did, Emily said. I just didn't stop saying so. By 4 p.m., she'd heard from Steph that 12 current staff members had already contacted the external audit line. By 5, the number was 19. She was checking on Winslow at 5:30 when he said, I want to know what happened with the board. She told him, leaving out the parts she didn't know and not speculating on the parts that were still developing. He listened with his eyes open and focused, tracking it the way he tracked operational information, not emotionally, just logging it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Moss gave them a name, he said. Aldous wouldn't confirm who, but yes. If it's who I think it is... He stopped, looked at the ceiling. This is going to take a long time, Callahan. Investigations usually do. Are you going to be all right here, in this hospital, after all of this? She thought about it honestly. I don't know yet. The board wants to have a conversation about my role. The staff dynamics are in flux. Pruitt is still technically employed, just not present. There's a lot that isn't resolved. But you're not leaving. No, she said. I'm not leaving. He looked at her with the same evaluating look he'd had from the beginning, the one that she'd learned over a very different day in a very different country meant he was deciding something. When I'm stable enough to move, he said, my team is going to need to debrief here on site. The investigation into who shot me, the connection to the procurement case, Mercy Voss is going to be a focal point for a while. I know. You're going to be a material witness. Aldous made that clear. And you're okay with that. I didn't start any of this, she said. But I'm not walking away from it. He nodded. Then he said, get some sleep tonight. Actual sleep. You're giving me instructions from a hospital bed. Yes, he said. Is that a problem? Not really, she said. She left his room at 5:45 Sam. She had 2 more patients to check on and a chart note to finish. And then, if nothing went wrong in the next hour, she was going to leave the building for the first time in 36 hours. She was finishing the chart note when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Not Hargrove's, not Aldis's. A third number she didn't have in her contacts. She opened it. The message was a photograph, a document, scanned, slightly skewed, like someone had photographed it on a desk rather than using a scanner. She had to enlarge it to read the header. Mercy Voss Medical Center. Employee Performance Documentation. Callahan, Emily R. Confidential. It was her file. Not the altered version she'd seen in the side-by-side comparison Osei had shown her. Something different. The formatting was slightly off, the font marginally inconsistent with the hospital's standard templates. She read through it and her chest went tight in a specific way because this wasn't the version that Moss had built, and it wasn't the version she'd filed, and it wasn't the version in the federal evidence file. It was a third version, one she hadn't known existed. And at the bottom, where a supervisor's signature block appeared, the name was not Harlan Moss. It was Wendell Pruitt. Below the photograph, the unknown number had sent a single line of text. He wasn't just covering for Moss. Ask Aldis who Pruitt's wife works for. She stared at her phone. Down the hallway, the elevator opened and Wendell Pruitt stepped off, the first time he'd been in the building all day. And he saw Emily at the nurse's station, and he stopped. He looked at her phone. He looked at her face. He knew. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Pruitt stood at the elevator. Emily stood at the nurse's station with her phone in her hand, and the photograph on the screen and the question sitting between them like something physical, like an object that had been placed in the hallway and couldn't be walked around. Then Pruitt moved first. Not toward her, away. He turned back toward the elevator and pressed the button, and the doors were already closing and he stepped into the gap with the particular urgency of a man who understood that the window was small and getting smaller. Emily was already calling Aldis. He picked up on the second ring. Pruitt just came into the building, she said. He's in the elevator, and I just received something. A photograph of a third version of my personnel file. Pruitt's signature at the bottom. She was already moving toward the stairwell. The text said to ask you who his wife works for. A pause. Short but perceptible, the pause of a man recalibrating. Where did the photograph come from? Unknown number. I don't know who sent it. Another pause. His wife's name is Renata Pruitt. She's on the board of directors of Viridian Integrated Systems. He said it with the flatness of a man who had known this and was now understanding that the information had become actively relevant. She joined their board 14 months ago. 14 months. The same month Emily had started at Mercy Voss. He wasn't covering for Moss, Emily said. He was protecting his own exposure. Get away from the elevator, Aldis said. His voice had shifted into a different gear, not alarmed, but operational. I'm sending someone to your floor now. Do not approach Pruitt. She was already in the stairwell. He's going down. Ground floor, probably. He came in through the main entrance. He'll try to leave the same way. We have people at the entrance. Go back to the floor. Aldis, Emily. He rarely used her first name. Go back to the floor. She stopped on the landing. The stairwell was empty, the fluorescent light steady above her, the building's nighttime quiet pressing in around the edges of the sound she could hear. Distant footsteps, a door, the elevator mechanism running somewhere below her. She went back to the floor. She found out what happened in the lobby in pieces, the way she'd found out everything else during the previous 36 hours, through fragments and secondhand accounts that she assembled into something coherent over the following hours. What she knew directly was this. She was at the nurse's station, watching the hallway, when Darla came from the direction of the administrative wing with a particular expression, not the news-bearing energy of the previous night, something quieter, more final.
Security just stopped him at the main exit, Darla said. Pruitt, 2 men from that federal team were already there. I know. He had a bag. Like he'd packed a bag, Emily. He came to the hospital with a bag. She absorbed that. A man who'd driven to the hospital at 5:30 p.m. with a packed bag, intending to, what exactly? Collect something, access something.
She'd find out later that he'd been trying to reach the medical records annex, that there was a specific file he'd wanted to retrieve, a physical document that hadn't been part of the digital systems Swick had managed, and that Pruitt had apparently only remembered existed when the scope of the federal investigation became clear to him that afternoon. He hadn't gotten anywhere near it. Darla was still standing there. Are you okay? Yes, Emily said. And she was, more or less, not in the sense of being unaffected, but in the sense that she was still standing at the nurse's station, still holding a chart, still present in the building and in the day and in herself. Go home, Darla. You've been here since this morning. So have you. I know. But I have a patient to check on, and then I'm leaving too. She looked at Darla. Thank you for the things you told me this week, the little things. It mattered. Darla looked like she might say something, then decided against it, then changed her mind. That cardiac patient. In November. I knew you were right. I didn't say it. I know. I'm sorry. You don't need to be sorry, Emily said. You needed to protect yourself. That was rational given what he'd done to other people. She paused. Next time, just say it. Darla nodded. She went home. Pruitt was formally arrested at 7:14 p.m. in the Mercy Voss lobby, in front of the information desk with its arrangement of plastic flowers and its sign about visiting hours. She didn't see it. She was in the ICU with Winslow, updating him on his evening vitals, when Aldous texted her a single line. Pruitt is in custody. Formal charges will be filed in the morning. She showed Winslow the text. He read it. He handed her phone back. He was quiet for a moment. Not the medicated quiet of the previous night, but the deliberate quiet of someone choosing what to say. His wife is the Viridian connection, he said. Yes. That's what they were protecting, the contract relationship. 42 million over 4 years, she said. And anyone who might have noticed something wrong got a performance review and a falsified record and a reason to leave quietly. He looked at her. You didn't leave quietly. No? She set his chart down. I didn't have the sense to. That's not what it was. I know what it was, she said. It was just, I kept being right, and I couldn't stop noticing that I was right, and at some point stopping felt worse than going on. He was quiet again. Outside the ICU window, the sky had gone fully dark, the parking lot lights coming on in their orange sodium glow, the helicopters still visible as dark shapes in the lot below. They'd been there 2 days now. She'd stopped noticing them. There's something I need to tell you, Winslow said, about why I'm here, beyond the investigation. You don't have to... The operation where you kept me alive the first time. He looked at the ceiling. I've thought about that night more times than I can count. Not just the medical part, the whole thing. The way you stayed calm when everything around you was the opposite of calm. The way you made decisions when there was no good information and no good options, and you just made them anyway. He looked back at her. I've worked with a lot of people over a lot of years. That particular quality is rare. She didn't know what to do with that, so she did what she usually did with things she didn't know what to do with. She acknowledged it and moved on. Get some rest. Your drainage is better and your BP is holding, but your body is still running a significant repair job and it needs the sleep. You're deflecting. I'm giving medical advice. She stood. It's what I do. He almost smiled. It was the most relaxed his face had been in 2 days. Callahan. What? You're going to be okay here. She picked up his chart. I know, she said. And she did know. Not with certainty, not with the clean confidence of a resolved situation, but with the particular knowledge of someone who had been through the previous 40 hours and was still standing at the end of them. So are you. She left him to sleep. The formal charges were filed the following morning. She learned about them from the Federal Investigations Public Affairs Office, which issued a press release at 9 a.m. that Aldous forwarded to her without comment. She read it at the break room table with a cup of coffee that was actually good this time, because someone had bought a different brand, and the details of what had been assembled over months of federal investigation were laid out in the specific, flattened language of legal documents that nonetheless told a story that was not flat at all. Harlan Moss, federal charges of obstruction of justice, healthcare fraud, and conspiracy to alter official medical records. 5 counts total. He'd been formally arrested at 6 a.m. at his home in the northern edge of Delverton, which was a house she'd never seen and didn't particularly want to picture. Gerald Swick, federal charges of records tampering and conspiracy. 2 counts. Wendell Pruitt, federal charges of conspiracy, healthcare fraud, and this was the part that required reading twice. Accessory to the suppression of federal whistleblower complaints, a charge that carried its own weight in the legal framework and that connected him directly to the Viridian procurement case. Renata Pruitt, under investigation. No charges filed yet, but the press release used the phrase ongoing review of related individuals in a way that made the direction clear. The press release also noted that an independent audit of Mercy Voss Medical Center's personnel documentation had been initiated and that the hospital's board of directors had engaged external oversight to manage the transition period. It named no specific staff members. She put the press release down. She drank her coffee. Phil came into the break room, poured himself a cup, and stood at the counter reading something on his phone. After a moment, he said, without looking up, "They're arresting people on the news." "I know. Pruitt," he said. "I've worked here 9 years. He ran this department." He put his phone in his pocket. He finally looked at her. "I believed what they said about you, about the insubordination." He said it directly, without hedging it into something more comfortable. "I thought you were a problem." "A lot of people did." "That's not an excuse." "No," she said. "It's not." She looked at him. "But it's also not something you need to carry around. He built it to be believable. That was the point." Phil nodded once, slowly. He picked up his coffee and went back to the floor. She sat in the break room another 5 minutes. She was thinking about Tamara from respiratory therapy, who'd left nursing over a fake performance review. She was thinking about the other 4, wherever they were, whatever they'd built in the time since Mercy Voss had convinced them they weren't good enough. She was thinking about what it cost a person to be told, repeatedly, officially, with documentation and signatures and institutional authority behind it, that their judgment was wrong and their instincts were a problem. She thought about the version of herself that might have believed it, if she'd come here without 6 years of knowing exactly who she was and what she could do. She was grateful she hadn't. Aldous met with her at noon in a conference room on the ground floor. Not the same room as the previous 2 nights, a different one, which felt like a marker of some kind. A new room for a different kind of conversation. He had Osei with him, and a third person she recognized from the interview 2 nights ago. "The investigation has enough to move forward without requiring your ongoing availability," Aldous said. He was looking at her in a way that was slightly different from his professional neutral expression. More direct. "Your testimony is complete and documented. You remain a witness of record, which means there may be requests for additional information as the case develops, but those will go through the external audit team and your attorney." "I still don't have an attorney." "You should get one." He said it without urgency. "Not because you need defense counsel. You don't. But because someone should be representing your interests in what comes next." "What comes next?" He glanced at Osei briefly. Something passed between them that she couldn't fully read. "The board of Mercy Voss has a significant liability exposure from the falsified documentation. The 6 affected employees, including you, have grounds for substantial legal remedy. I'm not saying this as legal advice. I'm saying it as context." She hadn't thought about that part. She'd been thinking about the patients and the charges and the investigation, and she hadn't thought about the part where the institution had done her immeasurable and documented wrong. "The other 5, she said, "are they being contacted about this?" "The external audit team is reaching out. That process started this morning." "Tamara." Is on the contact list. Yes. She nodded. She looked at her hands for a moment. They were not doing anything interesting, just folded on the table, slightly rough at the knuckles from frequent hand washing, a small scar visible on the left forearm. Ordinary hands. I don't want to sue the hospital, she said. I want to work in it. Aldous looked at her. Those things aren't necessarily... I know they're not mutually exclusive. I'm just telling you where I am. She looked up. The patients here didn't do anything. The nurses who were afraid to say something didn't do anything wrong. This hospital needs to work. I want to be part of making it work better. She paused. Whatever legal remedy means for the other 5, they should have it. They left. Their careers were affected. That's different from my situation. Osi was writing something. She didn't explain what. The board is going to want a conversation with you, Aldous said, about your role going forward. Given the scope of what's come out and the audit process and the external oversight, they need people they can trust in the clinical environment. He paused in the way he paused when he was about to say something precise. You have a significant amount of credibility in this institution right now. That's not nothing. I know, she said. I intend to use it. But the conversation with the board happened 3 days later in the main conference room on the 4th floor, the one with the view of the mountains. Patricia Vell ran it. There were 4 board members present and 2 external consultants from the oversight firm and a lawyer from the board's external counsel. Emily brought the attorney she'd retained the previous day, a woman named Cass Herring, who had 15 years of healthcare employment law experience and who had reviewed everything Emily had given her and said, with the flat satisfaction of someone looking at a very clear case, they're going to give you whatever you ask for within reason, so let's figure out what's reasonable. What Emily asked for, it turned out, was not what the board expected. She asked for reinstatement to active nursing status with her full record corrected and annotated with the audit findings. Not just cleared, but specifically documented as having been falsified, with the falsification noted. She asked for the same for all 6 affected employees, with the institution reaching out formally and acknowledging what had been done. She asked for an independent clinical review process going forward, a mechanism for nursing staff to raise concerns about clinical decisions without those concerns being routed through hospital administration. She asked to continue working in the emergency department. She did not ask to be promoted. She did not ask for a ceremonial title or a committee chair or any of the things that institutions handed out when they wanted to demonstrate remediation without actually restructuring anything. Cass Herring had advised her she could get a significant cash settlement and a director-level position, and Emily had listened carefully and said she'd take the record correction and the clinical review process and the letter of formal institutional apology and leave the rest for the other 5. Cass Herring had looked at her for a long moment and then said, all right, but we're getting them the settlement too. Yes, Emily had agreed. We are. In the board meeting, Patricia Vell had listened to the requests and conferred briefly with legal counsel, and then looked at Emily in the way people sometimes looked at her when they'd been expecting one thing and received another. These are not what I anticipated. I know, Emily said. The independent clinical review process is going to require significant structural changes. Yes, Emily said. It is. Vell looked at her a moment longer. Then she said, I think we can make those changes. Winslow was discharged on a Thursday, 11 days after he'd come in by ambulance with a gunshot wound and a subclavian laceration and a pericardial effusion that had nearly killed him twice. He walked out under his own power, which he'd been determined to do regardless of medical advice to the contrary, and which Emily had declined to argue with because she knew a pointless argument when she saw one. She was at the nurses' station when they brought him through the ER on the way to the exit. His team around him, Hargrove at his left, the man in the suit carrying the bags. He looked thin, the way people looked after significant trauma and 2 surgeries and 11 days of hospital food. He moved carefully. He stopped at the nurses' station. Callahan. Winslow. He looked at her for a moment with that evaluating look, and then he said, You should know. The investigation into who ordered the attack is progressing. The Viridian connection is opening things up. It's going to take time, but it's moving. Good, she said. And the 5 other employees, Piquat,
3 of them have been in contact with the audit team. The other 2 took more finding, but they've been found. She hadn't known the status. She felt something ease in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying without fully naming. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded. He shifted his weight, adjusted his stance. She could see the shoulder was still hurting him, the left side where the drain had been. "I'm going to recommend something to the people I work with," he said. "About this institution, about the audit process, about the structural changes you negotiated. I'm going to recommend they be used as a model." "For what?" "For what happens when whistleblower suppression meets an institution that decides to actually fix it, rather than manage the optics." He paused. "It doesn't happen as often as it should." She didn't know what to say to that. She said, "Take care of the shoulder. Physical therapy, not just rest. The surgical repair is solid, but the soft tissue needs work." "I know. I mean it, Winslow. I know you mean it." He almost smiled again. "That's why I'm going to actually do it." He left. She watched him go through the ER doors into the February light, still cold, still flat and pale. The kind of winter light that didn't commit to anything. The helicopters had been gone for 8 days. The parking lot looked ordinary. She turned back to the nurse's station and picked up the chart she'd been writing in. In the weeks that followed, the hospital changed. Not all at once. Not cleanly. Institutions didn't transform cleanly. They shifted and adjusted and resisted and gradually became different things, usually imperfectly, usually with friction. The external audit ran for 6 weeks and produced a report that was detailed and unflattering and became part of the public record of the federal proceedings. The independent clinical review process that Emily had negotiated was implemented in a form that was slightly diluted from what she'd asked for, and slightly stronger than what the board had initially proposed, which was roughly what implementation always looked like. Moss entered a plea agreement in March. The federal charges were reduced from 5 counts to 3, in exchange for full cooperation with the broader procurement investigation. He was sentenced to 31 months in federal prison and permanently barred from holding any administrative or clinical role in any healthcare facility in the country. His attorney had argued at sentencing that Moss had been operating under pressure from parties above him, which the judge acknowledged and which reduced his sentence by 8 months from the prosecution's recommendation. The judge's statement noted that this reduction did not diminish the severity of what he'd done to 6 people's careers and to the patients who had depended on an institution he'd compromised. Swick took a plea agreement 2 weeks before Moss. 18 months, no parole, immediate termination of his professional certifications. Pruitt's case was more complicated because the Viridian connection made it federal in a way that took longer to untangle. He was suspended from the medical staff pending the outcome of proceedings, which meant his medical license was under active review by the state board. By April, the state board had suspended his license pending adjudication. His attorney released a statement. Pruitt himself did not. Renata Pruitt was indicted in March on 2 counts related to the procurement fraud. She resigned from Viridian's board the same day. Viridian Integrated Systems lost its federal vendor status in April and was placed under administrative review. The contracts with Mercy Voss were terminated. Tamara, the respiratory therapist who'd left nursing 18 months ago, called Emily on a Tuesday in March. Emily was at home, which was a rare enough occurrence that she was slightly disoriented by the normalcy of being there. Tamara's voice on the phone was careful, the voice of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and wasn't sure yet whether it was safe to put it down. "The audit team explained what happened to my file," Tamara said. "I'd been telling myself for a year and a half that maybe they were right, that maybe I had been difficult, that maybe I didn't handle things correctly." "You handled them correctly," Emily said. "The documentation was changed." "I know that now." A pause. "I left nursing." "I know. I'm thinking about going back. I'm not sure, but I'm thinking about it." "You should," Emily said. "You were good at it. That didn't go anywhere." Another pause. How did you keep going when they were telling you every day that you were wrong?" Emily sat with that question. She looked at the window, at the gray March sky, at the ordinary Thursday afternoon outside it.
She thought about the answer honestly, the way she tried to think about things honestly without making it neater than it was. I wasn't always sure I was right, she said finally. I was sure the patient needed the intervention. That's not the same thing. I'd be lying if I told you the rest of it didn't shake me. The write-ups, the meetings, the way people looked at me. It shook me. She paused. But I'd learned before this what it felt like to make a decision under pressure and have it be the right one. And I'd learned what it felt like to doubt that and make it anyway. Once you know what that feels like, it's hard to talk yourself out of it. Tamara was quiet for a moment. Do you think I should come back to this hospital? I think you should go wherever feels right, Emily said. But if you want to come here, there's a clinical review process now. It's not perfect, but it exists. And I'll be here. Why does that matter? Because I'll say it out loud, Emily said. If something's wrong, I'll say it. And now there's a structure to say it through. Tamara said she'd think about it. She called back in April and said she'd applied for a position in the pulmonary care unit. She started in May.
The
ceremony was not Emily's idea. It was Winslow's, or rather it was the result of a conversation between Winslow and someone in his chain of command that Emily wasn't privy to, which resulted in a letter arriving at the hospital in late March requesting Mercy Voss's cooperation in hosting a formal recognition event. The board agreed immediately. Vel personally called Emily to tell her, with the particular enthusiasm of an institution trying to demonstrate its capacity for the right gesture. Emily said she'd attend. She didn't say she'd enjoy it. The ceremony happened on a Friday afternoon in the hospital's main conference center, which had been arranged with chairs and a small platform and more people than Emily had expected. Military personnel, hospital board members, members of the federal investigation team, and, the part that surprised her, a significant number of Mercy Voss staff, including nurses and residents and technicians, and the woman from dietary who'd noticed the file cart in the records annex and told Steph, which was a thing Emily hadn't known the origin of until Steph pointed it out. Colonel Hargrove presented the commendation, a distinguished civilian service recognition from the 7th Special Operations Group, given to individuals outside the military who had demonstrated extraordinary competence and personal courage in support of military personnel. He read the citation in the flat cadence of a military officer reading a formal document, which was precise and a little formal, and also, in its precision, accurate in a way that Emily found harder to receive than she'd expected. She stood at the front of the room and held the commendation and looked at the people in the chairs and felt the particular strangeness of being seen. Not assessed, not evaluated, not watched for problems, just seen as the thing she actually was. Winslow was in the front row. He looked better than he had in the hospital. More weight, more color, the shoulder he'd favored less prominent in his posture. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the ICU room, the evaluating look. And then something in it shifted into something less calculated. He nodded once. She nodded back. After the formal part, when people were standing and talking and someone had produced coffee and the room had relaxed into something more human, Steph found her near the windows. "How do you feel?" Steph asked. Emily looked at the commendation in her hand. She looked at the room, at Phil talking to a resident he'd never spoken to before, at Darla laughing at something Rath said, at the empty chair where Pruitt had sat in 100 meetings before his name became something people said in a different tone. "Tired," she said honestly. "And okay. That's a specific combination. It's where I am." Steph nodded. She handed Emily a cup of coffee. "Tamara starts in May." "I know. Dr. Olafs told me what you did in the ICU, the echo guidance. He said he doesn't usually—" Steph stopped. "He said he doesn't work that way with nurses usually, and he said it wrong, and then he kind of knew he'd said it wrong. He did good work in that room," Emily said. "We all did." "Yeah." Steph drank her coffee. "But you started it." Emily didn't argue. Later, when the room had thinned out and the chairs were being folded, Winslow found her by the exit. He had his coat on. He was leaving for another city, another case. The ongoing work of an investigation that was still unrolling towards something she would read about eventually in public documents and would understand in some parts and not in others. "The hospital's going to be better," he said. Slowly, she said. Slowly, he agreed, but better. He extended his hand. She shook it, and it was a formal gesture, but it also wasn't. It was the handshake of two people who'd been in a hard place together and had both come out the other side of it, which gave it a weight that the formality didn't quite cover. Take care of yourself, Callahan. You too, Winslow. He left. She stood at the exit for a moment. The afternoon was ending, the light going amber through the conference center windows, and beyond them the parking lot was ordinary and the mountains were visible in the long distance, and the hospital rose behind her with its ordinary and imperfect functions. Its people trying, its systems grinding along, its patients waiting to be seen and helped and sent home or kept, depending on what they needed. She had a patient to check on. She had a chart note to finish. She had a shift in the morning and another one after that, and somewhere in the next few weeks, a deposition related to the federal case and a follow-up meeting with the board about the clinical review process implementation, and a phone call she owed her sister who'd heard about some of it on regional news and had texted 17 times. None of that was resolved. Life didn't resolve. It just kept going, accumulating, asking for more. She clipped the commendation to the inside of her locker and put on her badge and went back to the floor. She'd been a nurse for 14 months at Mercy Voss. She'd been a medic before that in places that still showed up in her dreams occasionally, not as nightmares exactly, just as the particular texture of high-stakes moments that lodged in your memory and didn't fully leave. She'd been suspended and reinstated and investigated and recognized, all in the space of a few weeks, and she was still the same person at the end of it that she'd been at the beginning, imperfect, tired, certain of very little except the next right clinical decision. That had always been enough. It still was. The ER was busy. It was always busy. She walked in and took the handoff from the evening nurse and looked at the board and found her first patient and went to work. Not because anyone was watching, not because a commendation made it mean more than it had always meant. Because there was a person in Bay 3 who needed attention, and she was the one who could give it, and that was the whole of it, the same as it had always been. The simple, unglamorous, demanding truth of showing up and doing the thing and not stopping when it was hard. She'd never been here for recognition. She pulled back the curtain and said, "Hi, tell me what's going on." And the patient told her, and she listened, and the work continued.